A martial arts coach thought he was being funny when he challenged a black woman to a fight as a joke. The whole dojo laughed, until her response turned that laughter into stunned silence. Stay with us, because what happened next isn't just about fighting, it's about dignity, respect, and the power of the overlooked. And before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Naomi Bell organized her life into quiet reliabilities. She woke early to the low hum of the fridge and the sizzle of a pan, packed a lunch that never tried to impress anyone, and made sure the bills stacked in a shoebox were handled before they turned red. By 8, she was at a cubicle 3 bus stops from home, clearing inboxes and smoothing other people's mistakes with sentences that began, "No problem. Here's a clean copy." She was 38, a mother first, and a woman who had learned that being dependable was a kind of armor when the city would not offer you one. Every evening belonged to Amira. At 16, her daughter moved with the careful precision of someone learning to trust her own body. They had tried choir and track and a tutoring club that promised scholarship, pipelines but delivered little more than glossy handouts. Martial arts looked different. It asked for sweat and offered back posture. It spoke a language that could not be graded on a curve. Within months at Dalton's Martial Arts Academy in Southwest Houston, Amira's shoulders drew level, her gaze stopped dodging. The mirror and her voice, small in classrooms where hands like hers were called on last, found volume in a well-timed ki. Naomi watched from the benches and let relief wash the edges of her day. The dojo looked like success. Mirrors were buffed to a hard shine, mats were wiped down until they squeaked. Trophies stood shoulder to shoulder along a shelf, their brass figures frozen in flying kicks beneath fluorescent lights. Parents sat in a neat row, some with laptops open, others murmuring about algebra tests and soccer schedules. The air smelled of disinfectant and rubber, undercut by the citrus cleaner used on the glass. A sign at the front read respect, discipline, humility in block letters that left no room for argument. Coach Rick Dalton commanded the room with the confidence of a man who believed the sign had been his idea. He was tall, crisp in a black belt tied with a practice knot, and efficient with praise. His corrections came fast. His tone carried without shouting, and he had mastered the theatrical pause that made a child's error feel like the drumbeat before a verdict. New parents loved him. Veteran parents called him tough but fair in the way people do when they've never had to measure the cost of tough. Naomi learned the room differently. She watched where Rick's patience thinned and where it grew elastic. When Evan Pierce, a lanky white freshman, forgot an entire combination, Rick grinned and turned the mistake into a teachable moment about footwork. When Jordan Howard, the shortest boy on the line with hands that never knew where to rest, clipped a kick by a few degrees, the correction arrived like a slammed door. Again. Count it. Respect the technique. The difference wasn't shouted, so it sounded harmless to people who only listen for volume. Naomi had trained herself to hear tone. Patterns emerged the way water patterns stone, slowly, then unmistakably. Sophia Mendoza tightened her jaw before Rick reached her lane, because the scolding always landed a half beat early. A newcomer named Aaliyah learned to tuck her chin not from a drill but from bracing against embarrassment. Amira absorbed the imbalance with that careful, deliberate calm of a black girl in public, body balanced, eyes steady, effort doubled. Naomi felt pride catch in the same place that sorrow lived. The dojo was chiseling her daughter into something strong. It was also teaching her how to stand still under a gaze that never tired. Money weighed into the ritual, as money always does. Tuition pulled at their budget each month, so Naomi stretched dollars with coupons and late-night meal prepping that could turn one pack of chicken into 3 dinners. When Amira needed new sparring gloves, they cut cable and lived on free streams and library DVDs. Naomi kept every dojo receipt in the shoebox with the bills and ran her finger along the stack some nights as if she could measure progress by thickness. It's an investment, she told herself while rinsing rice in a mesh strainer, the water running cloudy until it ran clear. Amira's reasons for staying were simple and honest. She liked the way her heart beat steady after a hard round. She liked routines that rewarded repetition. She liked the bow at the beginning and end, the way it made the space feel like more than a gym. School gave her complicated lessons about being overlooked. The mat gave her uncomplicated ones about where to put her feet. Naomi understood. The world had taught her early that having a practice, any practice, could anchor a person when the current pushed sidewise. On Tuesdays, Naomi left work with a plastic container of leftovers, ate standing at the counter while flipping through a thin binder of household notes, then drove the cracked streets to the strip mall, where the academy shared a lot with a laundromat and a taco place. She liked arriving 10 minutes early. It gave her time to settle at the bench, set her phone face down, and watch. The room changed shape when the warm-up ended and serious work began. The children bowed to the mirrors, then to each other. The order mattered. Bowing first said something out loud that the world too often swallowed. People come before performance. Practice nights blended into a kind of liturgy. Stretch. Drills across the floor. Partner rounds with clapping mitts and Velcro straps popping like small thunder. Naomi tracked the sequence the way a nurse tracks a pulse, listening for steadiness, listening for change. Rick moved down the line with metronome consistency, until inconsistency suited the lesson he wanted to teach. When Amira's technique was clean, he called it half-effort. When Ryan, a junior with a scholarship ribbon on his gym bag, threw off balance. Heat. Rick called it fighting spirit and told the room to take notes. Naomi swallowed hard and let the breath out slow, because the alternative was standing up and saying what no one wanted to hear. She had promised herself that Amira's growth would not be stolen by a scene. She steadied herself with small rituals, inventorying the contents of the bag at her feet, counting the seconds. Between Rick's corrections, tracking whose names he said with patience and whose names fell like penalties. It was a private math that always added up to the same answer. One Thursday brought the first open floor of the month, a longer session where parents could watch sparring with optional light contact under close supervision. The benches filled early. A group of white dads leaned unintentionally wide over the rail, their humor easy, their son's advances a given. Denise Howard took a seat at the end again, shoulders squared by habit, eyes set on her boy before anything else. Naomi slid in a few chairs down. Between them sat a gap that wasn't distance so much as space saved for interruptions that never came, a text from a boss, a call from a school, a bill collector with the wrong number. Rick set the rounds to 2 minutes. The tempo quickened. Control, he reminded them, is not optional. Naomi liked that sentence, not as a threat, but as a truth in a city that taught people to equate power with the right to overflow. Control meant dignity held its ground. Amira sparred Sloan first, a quiet sophomore whose footwork clicked like well-oiled gears. The exchange was tidy and exact. Then Rick rotated lines, and Amira stood opposite Ryan. The boy's energy read as performance, hands a little too high, bounce a little too showy. The first kick landed heavier than the round called for. Amira adjusted. The second carried the thud of someone proving something to an audience. Amira changed angles and took heat out of the contact with geometry. She finished the round balanced and sharp, the kind of control that deserves a nod. Rick called the group in and used the moment to deliver a lesson that twisted clean effort into an object lesson in supposed timidity. Amira, he said, had hesitated, had held back, had let the moment pass. He pointed to Ryan as the example of commitment. Naomi watched her daughter's face hold neutral, the practiced calm of someone refusing to give a critic the satisfaction of a win. The correction lodged like a burr anyway. Jordan's gaze went to the floor. Sophia stared straight ahead, learning what not to look at to keep from crying. The drive home ran silent for 6 blocks. Naomi had learned not to rush comfort. She measured the gap between the buzzer and the truth a child could carry. When she finally spoke, it wasn't to fix anything. It was to name what had happened without letting it bruise the whole night. Amira nodded once and let the words find a shelf. At home, they ate leftovers and reviewed a geometry proof. The world places so many verdicts on a girl, Naomi made sure equations still gave clean answers. Work traced its own small violences. A coworker mispronounced Naomi's name for the 8th month in a row and laughed as if the joke belonged to the room. A manager thanked her for being so articulate after a presentation that consisted of reading numbers out loud. The building security officer greeted the man behind her with "Sir," and greeted Naomi with a chin lift that had never learned a name. None of it was worth a formal complaint. All of it added weight to the part of the day that had to pretend the number wasn't moving. Saturday Equipment Day offered a temporary reprieve. Naomi took Amira to a local shop that smelled like new leather and cardboard. They weighed the cost of dipped foam versus vinyl-covered pads and chose the ones that would last long enough to justify the dollars. Amira slipped on headgear and laughed into the hollow echo of her own voice. Naomi let herself enjoy the simple math of fit and function, the way the right glove made the hand close comfortably instead of like a fist hammered into shape. On the way home, they stopped at a park and took a slow half lap around the track. A church group barbecued at the far pavilion. A boy threw a football that never seemed to land wrong. In the shade, an old man worked a Tai Chi form with the patience of a clock. Amira walked with an easy roll in her step that didn't exist 6 months ago. The practice was doing its work, and Naomi loved it for that, even as the dojo's other lessons tried to thread themselves into her daughter's understanding of who deserved tenderness. A week later, the Academy announced a showcase. Families, photos, a glossy flyer with the trophy shelf reflected in its own shine. Rick promised demonstrations of technique and the gap between average and excellence. The phrase stuck with Naomi. She understood what he meant and also what he might choose to mean. The world likes to turn excellence into a mirror that only shows one kind of face. She circled the date on the calendar and underlined it, not because she wanted a photo, because she wanted a record of when to pay extra attention. In the run-up to the showcase, drills sharpened. Rick's corrections grew clipped. He began using individual students as examples more often, pulling one to the center, to display how not to pivot, how not to guard, how not to extend a kick. The spotlight burned hottest on the same small set. Jordan learned to count loud enough that counting became the entire point. Sophia's guard became perfect under pressure because imperfection cost tears. Amira's guard became a promise, not a technique. She held it like a line that said, "I understand you are looking for a reason to call me less. You will not find it here." Naomi's bench view widened in ways that had nothing to do with eyesight. She noticed who cheered for whom. She noticed how laughter traveled, who started it, where it landed, who swallowed it because laughter would turn them into the joke. She noticed which parents brought snacks for everyone and which offered only to the kids who looked like their kids. She noticed a flyer taped near the desk for a self-defense seminar and wondered how it would speak about danger to a room that didn't want to call danger by its right name. She also noticed small goodness wherever it refused to die. An assistant instructor with a soft voice who went out of his way to correct Jordan's stance in a corner without the whole room watching. A white mom who slid over on the bench to make space for Denise without making a show of the gesture. A boy who picked up a dropped mouthguard case that didn't belong to him and rinsed it at the water fountain before the owner even saw it was gone. The dojo was not a single thing. It was an argument between the best and worst of what a community can teach. Amira asked to add a morning jog on weekends. Naomi bought reflective bands and an inexpensive digital watch and agreed to run the first mile together before peeling off to let her daughter work. They passed construction sites where cranes drew new angles into the skyline and empty lots where grass moved against the wind as if it had grown tired of being the only green for blocks. They said little. Breath has its own conversation. Naomi felt the rhythm of her feet remind her that a body is a story you get to tell one step at a time. 2 days before the showcase, a printed testing list went up on the bulletin board with a clip that had lost its spring. Names underlined in red meant likely, the front desk explained. Black meant review after showcase. Evan's name wore red. Ryan's name wore red. Amira's wore black. So did Jordan's and Sophia's. Naomi stood long enough to be sure she wasn't misreading. She did not say a word in that lobby. Words spoken too early have a way of teaching the wrong lesson to the wrong audience. That night, dinner was beans and rice and a pot of greens that took 3 hours to soften because patience was the only thing they could afford in bulk. Naomi stirred with a wooden spoon that had lost half its varnish and listened to Amira talk through the plan. More shadow, rounds, more footwork ladders, more time on the bag at home where nobody could call controlled power hesitation. Naomi nodded and handed her a towel and made sure she drank water and did not let the injustice change the shape of the table where they ate. Sleep ran shallow that week. Naomi would lie awake and count sounds, the elevator at the end of the hall, the ice maker's rare clunk, the late bus sighing 3 blocks over. Every count ended at the same feeling, the sense that a choice was coming into focus whether she wanted to see it or not. She was a mother who believed in gates and guardians. She also understood that sometimes the gate itself is part of the problem. She had promised Amira space to earn her own way. She had not promised to let a man teach her child that humiliation was a legitimate training tool. Showcase day landed with the weight of a small holiday. Kids showed up early with hair braided and uniforms bright. Parents wore shirts that said Team Dalton and carried phones poised for the kind of video that fills group chats. Rick greeted families with a smile that lived in the teeth more than the eyes. He stacked boards for breaking, lined up demo teams, and positioned himself at center as if the floor were a stage and he knew every line. Naomi arrived with a folded lawn chair in the trunk in case the benches filled, a Ziploc of orange slices, and the calm of someone who understood that watching closely is not a passive act. She hugged Denise and left her a space on the bench like always. She scanned the room and cataloged small details she might need later. Who held the camcorder for whom, where the assistant instructors stood, which drills were set near the windows and which in the back, where poor lighting could blur a mistake into unclear footage. Demonstrations began with synchronized basics to a drum track piped through a Bluetooth speaker. The kids moved in clean unison except for the inevitable micro-stumbles that make a room human. Rick narrated with professional polish. He highlighted control, focus, respect. Then he pivoted to show what happens when focus breaks, and pulled 3 students forward to miss on purpose so he could correct them in front of the crowd. He chose the same 3 he always chose. Naomi felt the room's energy tilt. Laughter rose then died as some parents sensed the edge of the spectacle. The children stood in the center and absorbed it because they had learned to. Amira's lane executed their sequence cleanly. She stepped back with feet under shoulders and eyes level, steady as a metronome that refused to be rushed. Naomi let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding and filed the moment in her mind like a case note. After a board break rotation and a forms demonstration, Rick called for a pressure and control segment. He liked those words. They framed whatever came next as teaching even when it strayed. He had 2 students spar light for the crowd and narrated what they were doing wrong between exchanges. Then he called Amira forward with Ryan and instructed them to show a sharp but safe round. The exchange began balanced. Amira managed distance with small angles, kept her strikes technical, and refused the urge to match Ryan's pushiness with heat. Halfway through, Rick's narration slid. He called Amira's restraint uncertainty and praised Ryan for committing. The round ended without drama. The message didn't. Parents filed it away. Kids felt it lodge. Naomi let the quiet inside her go very still, because stillness can be a form of strength when the room mistakes silence for permission. When the showcase closed with group bows, the applause felt loud enough to drown the uneasy parts if a person wanted it to. Naomi did not. She clapped for the children. She did not clap for the lesson hidden in the commentary. She helped Denise collect Jordan's gear and walked Amira to the car with the oranges still cold in the bag. The day had given the community a clean photograph. It had also developed the negative. Back home, Naomi set the oranges in the fridge and took the shoebox from the closet. She added the showcase flyer and the testing list printout, dated both, and slid them behind the stack of receipts. She had never been a person who loved paper. She had learned to love paper when it refused to lie. She wiped the kitchen counter with long, even strokes and let the cloth carry away what could be carried away. Night stretched long. Amira did homework at the table and then hung her uniform to dry. She rolled out her calves with a foam cylinder that had lost its label. Naomi tidied a living room that didn't need tidying and watered the plant by the window that never seemed to thrive but refused to die. The apartment held the same quiet it always held at this hour. Only Naomi had changed, just enough to admit to herself that watching would not be enough forever. The next week resumed with the same rituals, drills, pads, footwork. The sign on the wall preaching virtues the room struggled to practice evenly. Naomi kept her seat, kept her breath, and kept the ledger only mothers know how to keep, every slight balanced. Against every stride forward, every harm weighed against whether the healing would leave a scar or a story. She could not control the way an instructor chose to teach. She could control whether a lesson rooted in contempt got passed down to her child unchallenged. She waited. She watched for the moment when stepping forward would teach the right thing to the right people for the right reasons. That moment had not arrived yet. She would know it when it did. The body knows when the line is crossed. The heart knows when the pause becomes a dodge. The mat would show everyone eventually which was which. For now, Naomi did what strong people do when no one sees it. She prepared, in small, ordinary ways that leave no mark on a calendar. She packed an extra ice pack in the dojo bag and tucked a notebook between the hand wraps. She checked the car's gas the night before so they wouldn't be late. She slept when sleep came, and when it didn't, she counted breaths until morning, and chose gentleness on purpose because gentleness is a kind of proof. Houston moved outside their windows, loud and indifferent. Inside, a mother and a daughter moved through their practices. One built combinations. The other built a readiness that had nothing to do with kicks and everything to do with the dignity she intended to defend. The sign on the dojo wall said respect, discipline, humility. Naomi believed in all three. She also believed in something the sign didn't say, but the bow implied: accountability. She would wait for the moment that made those 4 words mean the same thing. The weeks after the showcase hardened into a rhythm that looked orderly from the doorway and felt lopsided from the bench. Parents kept their unspoken seating chart. Phones lit the inside of their palms, and the blue mats shone as if polish could pass for fairness. Naomi arrived early when she could, late when traffic insisted, always with the same intent: watch closely enough that the story could not lie to her later. She had learned to treat observation like training, consistent, specific, recorded somewhere even if only in the body. The academy's schedule never changed, the pressure did. Corrections bit a little deeper on the same set of children, while indulgence flowed easily to the same others. Naomi tracked the pattern the way you track a stain in the ceiling, first as a shadow, then as a mark, and finally as evidence you cannot explain away. Amira trained into the problem rather than around it. She added quiet miles on weekend mornings, ladders in the parking lot when the park was too crowded, and shadow rounds in the living room after homework put her eyes to sleep. The work showed up in small ways that would have been invisible to a casual glance. Feet that found balance faster, shoulders that didn't rise with breath, a guard that stayed honest even when no one was watching. Naomi folded these notes into her understanding and refused to let a single practice carry the weight of a verdict. Steady accumulation was the only kind of victory they could afford to rely on. On the mat, the imbalance kept announcing itself in tones more than words. When Jordan's knee angled wrong, the correction landed like a summons. When Evan lost count or forgot a turn, the room absorbed it with an easy grin. When Sophia's hips lagged behind a kick, she was told to want it more as if desire could move joints. When Ryan swung heavy, his mess was framed as fire as if physics answered to enthusiasm. Rick Dalton's technique was impeccable, and his eye for detail was unforgiving. Naomi wished the eye for context had been trained with the same rigor. The academy preached respect, discipline, humility. She believed the words and watched their enforcement contradict their meaning. A test cycle was posted in sharp handwriting on a clipboard by the desk. Names in red meant likely, names in black meant review after. The red column was crowded with the usual surnames. The black column collected quiet kids and familiar targets. Amira's name sat there alongside Jordan's and Sophia's. Naomi stood in front of the board long enough to make sure her eyes were not tricking her, then walked away without comment because some conversations, if started too early, only teach a child how a parent looks when they beg. At home, she cooked beans and rice and a pot of greens that took the whole evening to soften, and let the rhythm of stirring calm the part of her that wanted to break something. The dojo's more dangerous lesson was subtler than any list. It arrived during pressure nights, when rounds ran longer and Rick narrated from the edge like a commentator. The format should have been instructive, it was often punitive. Amira sparred clean against Sloan, then controlled chaos against Ryan. She removed heat with distance, matched contact to the stated rules, and made choices that honored safety without surrendering intent. The narration bent those choices into a story about timidity. The audience heard that aggression was commitment and restraint was doubt. Naomi felt something in her chest tilt, a weight sliding off the shelf where she had been saving it for later. The room was not just training bodies, it was shaping definitions. If restraint became a synonym for fear, the sign on the wall would collapse into theater. Workdays mirrored the dojo's lessons in unpleasant ways. At the office, Naomi watched praise jump like a spark across familiar gaps. Leadership potential announced for the colleague who repeated her idea with a louder voice. Great culture fit attached to a hire, whose chief qualification seemed to be reminding the boss of himself. Microaggressions collected like lint, a mispronounced name presented as a joke, a backhanded compliment about being so composed, a joke about being too sensitive when she asked for the meeting notes to include what had actually been decided. None of it justified a formal complaint. All of it made the roof a little heavier to hold up. She came home tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix and found steadiness watching Amira run her form in the living room, breathing even, mistakes corrected without drama. The apartment did not fix the world. It helped her remember which lessons to reinforce when the world tried to teach the wrong one. Saturdays brought the whole zoo, siblings running the length of the benches, grandparents angling for the best view, phones held aloft like a small forest of metal flowers. On one of them, Rick closed class early and formed a wide circle for what he called clarity drills. He pulled 3 children into the center to demonstrate common errors and corrections. The choices were familiar. Jordan kept his eyes forward and breathed too fast. Sophia's guard wavered then held. A newer girl named Aaliyah learned to be a prop for a room that had not yet learned to protect her. Rick's voice stayed measured. The lesson landed anyway like a public filing. Naomi watched Denise watch Jordan and understood the calculation in her stillness. Parents of color are stereotyped for outrage and punished for even the outline of it. The cost of one scene can ripple into months of chilled treatment you cannot prove. Silence, deployed for protection, often looks like consent from the cheap seats. Naomi counted the beats between instruction and humiliation and logged them. The way you log a training plateau so you know when change actually happens. She had written enough private ledgers to know when the math had turned from messy to dishonest. At home, the shoebox grew thicker, a showcase flyer, a copy of the test list, a printout of the new class schedule with pressure days circled. Naomi added a slim library notebook to the bag and wrote dates and small quotes. In tidy lines, who was singled out, for what, and how the correction was phrased. She did not do it to write an exposé. She did it because memory is a kind negotiator with those who benefit from forgetting. Paper evens the bargain. Then came the Thursday that moved the needle from frustration to decision. The floor was set for controlled sparring. Parents lined the rail. The assistant instructors had pads clipped to their belts. The owner lingered near the desk as if to be seen without being involved. Amira's first round with Sloan was a catalog of clean basics. The second placed her across from Ryan. He entered with kinetic energy that read heavy even before the buzzer. The first exchange clipped too hard. The second pushed past the round's agreement. Amira absorbed, angled off, and answered with accuracy. The room saw competence. The narration called it hesitation. Ryan's overreach knocked Amira down once, hard enough that the mat made a sound. She stood with steadiness that refused drama. Naomi held her seat because she had promised not to steal her daughter's agency with her own curtain pull. The round ended without worse harm. The words that followed did the real damage. Rick stopped the class and told the circle to study commitment, pointing at Ryan as the example, reframing contact as courage and restraint as lack. He held the floor long enough for the message to soak in. Amira listened without flinching. Jordan stared at the line where the mat met the wall. Sophia lifted her guard mid-speech because the body tries to protect what the room won't. Naomi watched the lesson slip toward doctrine and felt the shelf in her chest, where she stores patience, money, and promises, give a small, permanent creak. She drove home without narration, let dinner be simple, and exhaled only after Amira went to bed. In the quiet, the decision she had been circling resolved into a line she would not let be crossed again. She did not call anyone. She did not write a speech. She did what people do when they are serious. She prepared small things you cannot see from the bleachers. She packed a spare mouthguard in the bag and coiled hand wraps neatly. She added a frozen water bottle that would sweat into a cold cloth by the time they needed it. She ironed Amira's uniform because looking sharp helps a child feel held. She slept lightly and woke before the alarm. The next evening, the academy hummed with the messy energy of a week almost over. Drills ran, feet thudded, and the sign on the wall made its same big promises. Naomi's attention arrived at the very edge of the mat a minute before Rick called for a closing demonstration. He liked to end on a certainty, and the room gave it to him by squeezing into a circle. Bases upturned, ready for the kind of clarity that tidies away disagreement. He let his gaze travel around the ring like a camera and, at the last instant, set it on Naomi. He invited her to step in as an engaged parent to help him illustrate pressure and control. She stepped without fanfare because refusing would have made the wrong point. Control began in the bow. She bowed to the mirror and to the room. The floor softened a little underfoot the way mats do when a crowd leans forward all at once. She took her stance the way she takes her seat at work, lines clean, no flourish, all business. He announced that contact would be controlled. She did not waste breath agreeing. She made a condition instead, a narrow one with an exit for both of them. If she failed, she would own it publicly. If he failed, he would apologize publicly to those he had diminished. The sentence was short enough to memorize. The room did. The round began as practice does when people know others are watching, clean, careful, extra precise. He increased speed the way a person does when precision feels insufficient under a gaze. She let speed miss. He layered combinations. She answered with angles that made effort look inefficient. Spectators who come for impact misread avoidance as luck for the first 30 seconds. After a minute, they hear the pattern. After 2, they understand they are observing a system. Not tricks, not show, but proof that restraint is not absence. Restraint is a skill. When frustration taught his body to reach for a signature, he reached. The spin arrived as predicted by anyone who has watched the catalog of a proud technician. Her answer was invisible to the untrained, a reroute of balance at the margin. Where leverage lives, a touch that made gravity find him sooner than expected. He fell without drama. The silence that followed did the rest. Naomi took one step back and left him room to stand. She repeated the condition. The apology came, halting but audible, aimed where it needed to go. He named contempt as a disguise some people mistake for standards. He acknowledged uneven enforcement. He bowed. The room bowed back. No one clapped. The children breathed. Naomi did not stay at center. She became background again because the point was not her. Denise's shoulders dropped for the first time in a month. Jordan blinked slowly like a boy waking. Sophia's guard lowered without fear. Amira's face settled into a quiet that held pride without needing to announce it. The circle broke into the ordinary chaos of bags and shoes and opinions half-whispered. The story walked to the parking lot where it would be told with inaccuracies. That did not matter as much as the parts no one could unsee. At home, Naomi put the uniform in the sink to soak and set the bag where it always sat by the door. She did not open the shoebox or add a page to the notebook. The ledger now included something you could not staple to paper. A line had been drawn in a room where the sign on the wall had been allowed to mean too little. Accountability had been said out loud with the children listening. That mattered most. The next morning, a handful of parents found half-forgotten videos and old flyers that gave shape to a history the academy had not known. The messages pinged and buzzed as adults tried to reconcile the woman on the mat with rumor and compressed footage. Naomi did not answer questions she hadn't been asked. She made breakfast, checked on a bill, and went to work, where the inbox did not care about the previous evening. Humility was not a performance for her, it was a discipline. Show up, do the work, keep the promises posted on your own wall. The academy faced its choice in the daylight. An apology could be treated as closure or as the start of change. Naomi did not wait to see which way it would bend. She did what she had been doing all along, watching with intent, refusing to let bitterness sneak into the place where vigilance belongs, and preparing to reinforce the lesson if it started to slide. She understood that repair takes longer than spectacle and rarely earns applause. She also understood that children learn from whatever the room repeats. If the new rhythm held, the sign on the wall might finally match the floor under it. What mattered next was simple and difficult. Whether discipline would become policy, whether respect would be measurable, and whether humility would be practiced by people whose names did not rhyme with apology. The weekend after the apology, the academy looked the same from the door. White walls polished, mirrors, trophies catching the light, yet the current around the benches had shifted. Conversation lowered a register. Assistants stood closer to the lines they used to watch from across the room. Children bowed in with the same eagerness, but a tension that had lived. In shoulders for months eased as if someone had finally named the weight. Rick arrived early and called his staff into the small office that smelled of tape and cleaner. The door stayed half open. He talked less than he used to, and listened while Marisol, the junior instructor, with careful eyes, mapped the problems plainly. Enforcement had been uneven, praise traveled along familiar lanes, pressure had drifted into performance. Kids were learning the wrong definition of commitment. He didn't paper over it with talk of standards. He wrote on a legal pad. The assistants added specifics: who was singled out and how often, where tone did damage, what a fix might look like. When the meeting broke, they stepped onto the floor with a plan that cared more about today than about defending yesterday. Partner assignments rotated by a chart instead of convenience. Corrections were kept brief, neutral, and delivered at mat level to one child at a time, not to a crowd at the expense of a single example. Promotion criteria were posted on the wall with boxes that could be checked by any coach, then counter-checked by another. Pressure nights kept the contact rules and split narration between two voices, one to describe mechanics, one to protect language from drifting into judgment. The owner added an anonymous feedback line that reached both him and the instructors. A code of conduct for coaches and a parallel one for parents went up on the corkboard: clear, unglamorous, actionable. The floor changed in details first. Jordan's stance corrections moved to the corner where no one felt invited. To laugh, his guard stayed high without being welded there by fear. Sophia's hips caught up to her kicks, not because she was told to want it, more but because Marisol showed her the angle that made the joint obey. Evan forgot a count and received a crisp reminder: nothing more, nothing less. Ryan's power was measured to the round's intent, and when it wasn't, the break was immediate and unemotional. The room learned that consistency is a temperature children can breathe in. Naomi kept her place on the bench and her rituals intact, bag organized, phone face down, attention intentional. She noticed where attention flowed and where it was redirected. She noticed which parents stopped watching only their own children and began to watch the line. She noticed Amira's steps steady out of habit rather than caution. She did not insert herself into the staff's work. She brought cut fruit and spare wraps, and the kind of nod that tells another mother she is not alone. The testing list was updated 2 weeks later. The board no longer announced likely and review after with marker colors that performed certainty. It listed names and dates, prerequisites, and room for a second check. Amira's evaluation moved from limbo to a scheduled time. Jordan's did as well. Sophia's included a note about hip alignment to sign off before the week. The lobby, used to treating lists like verdicts, adjusted to treating them like plans. On a Thursday reserved for longer rounds, Amira worked through sequences with Sloan. then rotated to a newcomer who kicked too hard and apologized too often. She matched contact to the posted standard and, between exchanges, tapped her glove twice, a tiny signal to breathe that didn't call a coach across the room. Jordan worked with an older boy who once would have turned their drill into theater. The older boy followed Marisol's cue, slowed down, and discovered that controlling himself took more skill than proving he could overwhelm someone smaller. Rick held the edge of the mat and counted a round without narration, learning how to let a lesson stand on its mechanic. At home, the shoebox lived on the closet shelf where it always had, heavier, now with flyers and lists and a single page of Naomi's tidy notes. She didn't add to it that night. Paper had done its job. The room was trying to match memory with change. The owner asked Naomi to lead a Saturday session for parents and kids about the words on the wall. She agreed and arrived with a handful of index cards and more silence than a stage expects. She began by bowing and then broke the bow into parts. It wasn't decoration, it was a promise. Person before performance, respect before evaluation. She described restraint as a measure of control, not of doubt, explained that correction is a form of care that fails if care isn't felt, outlined how praise should follow improvement, not only excellence. She didn't reach for biography to authenticate the message. She let the room stand inside practical changes it could keep repeating on Monday. Rick stood in the back and didn't add commentary at the end. Marisol fielded a question about partner sizes. An assistant explained how to stop a round without embarrassment. Parents took photos of the posted criteria rather than only their own children. In small ways, the academy began to care more about systems than about moments. Workdays didn't soften to match the dojo's progress. Naomi still navigated meetings where ideas had to grow taller to be seen. She still caught small jokes that made names into convenience. But the edge dulled slightly knowing that one room in the city, the one where her daughter practiced, was learning to honor what it promised out loud. She answered emails, corrected a vendor invoice, and declined an after-hours task disguised as a compliment. She went home and watched Amira run a form in the narrow corridor between couch and table, steps crisp, breathing even, dignity intact. The next test day arrived without fanfare. The gym opened early. Tape on the mat marked lanes. Assistants checked gear. Parents filled the benches with quiet nerves. The criteria sheet lay on a clipboard with boxes to tick. When Amira's name was called, she stepped forward and bowed. Her basics were exact, not flashy. Her combinations stabilized when a wobble tried to creep. Her conditioning block did what conditioning blocks do, made a point with the clock. She finished the sparring section by absorbing a rush and recentering without turning the round into a score. The grader ticked boxes and wrote a single note about a foot angle that had already corrected itself by the last exchange. She passed. A stripe was added. No speech was made. Jordan's test followed. He worked through stances with a concentration that belonged to someone older. His round was matched with a partner who kept contact honest. And when Jordan's count went too quiet, Marisol tapped the clipboard and held up 3 fingers, not as a scold but as a target. He hit it and kept it. He passed. His mother pressed a tissue to the corner of one eye, as if a speck had flown in at just that moment. She laughed at herself, and then at the idea that she had to hide it. Sophia's alignment note cleared 2 nights later. The checkmark next to it meant hip and foot now agreed to travel together. She slept well for the first time in weeks. Repair rarely earns applause, it earns routines. The code on the corkboard gathered a few fingerprints from straightening. The anonymous line received fewer messages and more specifics. It felt better turned into, here's where it slipped. When it did slip, because rooms do, someone caught it earlier, named it, and adjusted. Rick learned to ask another coach to sanity check a decision before he made it final when his gut felt too certain. He learned to praise restraint out loud. He learned to end a pressure night by pointing to a moment of control rather than to a loud exchange. The first outside request reached Naomi's inbox from a community center that had heard about a plain-spoken session on respect. The budget could cover bus fare and water. She said yes. She spent a Thursday evening handing out loaner mitts and teaching kids to bow before they touched pads. She let the boys hold targets while the girls kicked first, then switched, tracked, who apologized for taking space and who didn't, and set drills accordingly. She said the word bias once and spent the rest of the time giving the body-level tools that let a child tell respect from its counterfeits. The kids taught each other, which was the point. Invitations like that found her every few months. A girls' shelter asked for a self-possession workshop. A school counselor asked if she could meet a student who braced for trouble, even when it wasn't coming because another room had trained her to. Naomi didn't turn any of it into a brand. She kept a paper planner with dates and bus routes and notes about how many gloves to bring. She treated each space like the dojo bench. Show up, notice, adjust. Leave the room stronger than you found it. The academy kept evolving in increments. A 7th grader started pairing himself with new kids on purpose. Evan sent a message to a team thread. Admitting he had laughed at the wrong times and was working on it, the thread pinned it without jokes. Parents learned to cheer after a glance between partners, rather than as if performances happened alone. The trophies on the shelf caught the same light but meant less. The clipboard meant more. One evening, near the end of a long cycle of tests, the room closed with bows, and the owner announced a small change with outsized meaning: promotion. Ceremonies would include a section where older students named one specific instance they saw of respect or restraint from someone else. The point was not public speaking, it was memory training. Children would learn to mark what matters rather than what dazzles. The first round of these testimonies were short and awkward and perfect. A boy named a partner who reset a round when heat crept in. A girl named the assistant who corrected her in a corner so she wouldn't cry in front of everyone. Amira named Jordan for the way he kept his count when it mattered. Jordan named Sophia for the way she taught him to pivot without making him feel like a problem to be solved. Naomi stood by the door and let the words do their work on the room. She didn't need the story people told about her to grow or shrink. She needed this, a floor that held the weight of a sign it had posted for years. When the lights dimmed, she helped push a rack of pads into a closet and said goodnight to Marisol with the unadorned gratitude of people who share a job without having to define it. Houston did not change to match a single dojo's better habits. Meetings still asked her to be twice as prepared to answer the same question. Emails still pretended to be emergencies at 6:03 p.m. The elevator still skipped her good evening some nights. The city kept its pace. Naomi kept hers. She cooked, ironed a uniform, mended a torn strap, and set an alarm. She watched Amira study in a sweatshirt with the sleeves pushed up and understood that the work of protecting a child's dignity isn't dramatic, it's scheduled. The academy announced a community night. No flyers with glitter, no stage lights, just an open invitation to parents, neighbors, and kids from other programs to train together, bowing taught before combinations, partner selection modeled by coaches, rules posted and followed. Naomi brought a bag of oranges and a roll of paper towels because people forget to plan for simple things. 2 boys from down the street who had never set foot on a mat learned how to bow and how to reset around when they got excited. Their mother thanked Naomi on the way out as if she had hosted the whole event. Naomi pointed to the sign and said nothing else. On a warm evening that smelled faintly of rain, the academy tied a stripe on Amira's belt. The ceremony was brief and exactly as important as it needed to be. Photos were taken without speeches. Denise hugged Jordan and then hugged Naomi, quick and firm. Rick shook hands without commentary. Marisol stacked clipboards and smiled without explanation. The room emptied in pieces until the mat lay bare and quiet. Outside, the parking lot buzzed with the last talk of the night. Naomi and Amira walked to the car at an ordinary pace. They didn't narrate what the weeks had changed. The changes were visible enough: shoulders that stayed down, breath that didn't catch. When a coach walked by, a sign on a wall that had finally met its own standard. Naomi unlocked the car and placed the bag on the back seat where it always went. The city's noise moved around them like weather. Inside the car, quiet settled the way it does when a day has nothing left to prove. The City Invitational arrived with the low-grade electricity of a school night game. The venue was a high school gym dressed up for spectacle, banners taped over the scoreboard, folding chairs in crooked rows, a table of medals angled toward cameras. Check-in lines formed under fluorescent glare. Kids in white uniforms tried to look taller. Coaches tried to look calm. Parents carried bags like portable closets. The smell was dust, cleaner, and a hint of popcorn from a machine someone had found in a closet. Dalton's group clustered near the far baseline. Marisol handled the paperwork. Rick reviewed brackets with a highlighter that didn't survive the first hour. The owner hovered between the officials' table and his team, saying little and watching a lot. Naomi found a seat halfway up the bleachers with Denise and 2 other parents who had started watching more than one lane. They spread their bags along the bench like a border and then pulled them back to make space for a grandmother who took the stairs slowly. The early divisions moved quickly. Tiny forms performed with exaggerated effort, breaks that cracked. A little too close to fingers, cheers that sounded bigger than the bodies earning them. Naomi watched with the same attention she brought to the dojo, who was called to the center and why. How good job traveled across faces, whether a coach's hand settled heavy or light on a shoulder. Patterns announced themselves even under new banners. Certain clubs ran hot, their kids rewarded for volume. Others ran tidy, their kids praised for control. The judges promised neutrality, their consistency lagged by a beat when heat arrived. Amira's forms division drew a crowd. She stepped onto the taped square with that measured focus she'd built over months. Breath even, eyes steady. The room shrinking its noise without asking it to. Her form traveled in clean lines and finished without the wobble that haunts long sequences. The scores landed where they should, not top of field, not ignored. Rick offered a nod without commentary. Marisol tapped the clipboard once, which meant she'd seen what needed seeing, and would tell Amira later in a hallway where lessons stick best. Sparring took the floor after lunch. Rules were posted at the head table, target areas, contact level, warnings, escalating to point deductions, an emphasis on control bolded twice. The first few rounds honored the print. Then the gym warmed, and old habits crept in. Aggression earned crowd noise, and crowd noise tempted judges to mistake volume for value. Amira's first match paired her with a girl from a club known for pace. The early exchanges were clean, jab to the body, a measured counter, feet negotiating space like neighbors learning fences. When the other girl's tempo climbed, Amira used angles to remove heat. A judge marked a point late and uneven, then evened it on the next exchange with a generous call. The round held inside the rules if not inside every spectator's patience. Amira advanced without the need for explanations. The semi-final exposed the limits of posted rules. Her opponent came from a program that advertised no prisoners on t-shirts sold in the lobby. The first clash landed heavy. The second clipped an earguard hard enough that the gym heard it. The ref raised a hand to caution, then lowered it without issuing one. Amira absorbed, reset, and insisted on control with her choices. The scoreboard favored contact over craft. She lost by a margin that could have been printed either way. The handshake at center was crisp. The walk back to the bench was straighter than the score deserved. Naomi didn't narrate. She handed Amira water and a towel and let the body decide how many breaths it needed. Marisol noted the late warnings on the sheet, circled 2 exchanges, and nodded once to say she had seen what mattered. Rick stood near the rail with hands behind his back, eyes on the ring as if looking for a rule he had missed. He walked to the head table, said something brief, listened to a longer answer, and returned without theater. Other stories played out around them. Jordan fought through nerves like a swimmer pushing a cold lake, found his rhythm in the second minute, and lost a tight decision that felt like progress more than defeat. Sophia hit her form with hip alignment that would have made last month. Is judge right an asterisk? And today's judge wrote a clean score. Evan shouted too loudly for a teammate and then toned it down when Marisol lifted a finger, his correction arriving by habit rather than embarrassment. The team learned that judges in new gyms bring their own grooves and that you don't fix grooves with volume. You fix them by giving fewer chances to misread. Late afternoon bled into a final block of divisions. A boy from a different academy was pushed out of bounds twice without a reset called. His coach argued and earned a bench penalty. The boy cried quiet tears into his headgear and then finished under control. Naomi felt that familiar heat rise, anger disguised as breath, and let it move through without burning anything it shouldn't. She wrote nothing down. The ledger didn't need help finding this page. Medals clinked like small coins. The award photos tracked who stood on boxes and who did not. Dalton's kids took a handful, lost a handful, and carried themselves the same either way, which is the only metric that matters after the podium is rolled away. The gym emptied in a cascade of bags, protein bars, and mismatched shoes. Outside, dusk held the lot in a flat light that made everyone look a little tired and a little proud. In the car, Amira rested her head against the window and watched the city slide. She didn't ask what Naomi thought. She didn't need to. The answer lived inside the choices she had made under rules that hadn't fully held. She had refused to let another person's tempo write her language. That was the win. The next week at the academy, the tournament became curriculum. Marisol opened class with a review of calls, what was consistent, what wasn't, how to protect your form from someone else's chaos. Judges read what you write, she said. Not as a slogan, but as a task list. The sparring block drilled resets, how to step to neutral and make the ref do his job without turning your back into a target. They practiced an explicit gesture to signal a caution needed calling, calm, visible, non-theatrical. Children learned that fairness is enforced by habits, not by hope. Rick followed with a policy change. Any external event would be debriefed with notes. Posted on the corkboard. Calls observed, trends noticed, adjustments for training. The board grew a column labeled Control Moments. Times Dalton's kids had chosen restraint when chaos would have been easier. Jordan's name landed there with a brief description that read like a quiet trophy. Amira's did too, with a note about a reset that kept a round inside the rules without requiring a speech. Naomi sat on the bench and watched the room metabolize a weekend without turning it into grievance. This was the work she trusted, refusing to let a sloppy standard train the next choice. She sent a text to Denise about iced coffee at the corner place after class and got a thumbs up and a heart that Denise would deny sending if asked later in public. Small tests found their way into ordinary days. A newcomer arrived with swagger loud enough to fill the mat and learned in a week that control gets you noticed longer than noise. An assistant slipped into an old habit, using a child's mistake to narrate a lesson, and corrected himself mid-sentence. A parent started a too loud cheer and caught it after 2 claps. The sign on the wall stayed the same. The room learned to match it without being reminded by the sign. An email landed in Naomi's inbox from a journalist who had watched the invitational and wanted the backstory. The note was polite, and the subject line had the tone of someone looking for a hook. Naomi replied with thanks and a boundary. The story worth telling was the Academy's policy shifts and the way kids named each other's restraint. She pointed the reporter to the owner for comments on procedure. She did not offer any clip older than yesterday. Grief and history are not seasoning for a profile. They are rooms that deserve their own doors. The Academy hosted a community night 2 Fridays later. The mats were crowded with people who did not belong to any club yet, but belonged to a neighborhood. Bowing was taught before combinations. Coaches paired kids across ages and sizes with a precision that signaled safety. A boy who had never been corrected without being shamed learned what that feels like, his posture adjusted by an inch that mattered. A girl who had always apologized for taking space learned to hold mitts without flinching. Naomi brought oranges and paper towels again. She sliced, handed, watched, and kept the rhythm steady. A month rolled into another. Tests came and went without spectacle. The anonymous line at the Academy turned into a suggestion box with specifics instead of generalized complaints. Felt fair became, here's where it slipped, here's how we fixed it. The trophy shelf collected dust no one remembered to wipe. The clipboard on the corkboard needed a new binder clip because too many sheets had been added to keep the old one shut. One evening, after a session where the room had practiced resets until they looked like choreography, the owner announced a small addition to ceremonies. Older students would name one instance of respect they had seen that week in someone else. The first time they tried it, the words were halting and exact. A boy named his partner for easing contact without being asked. A girl named an assistant for correcting her in a corner when tears had been close. Amira named Jordan for counting steady when his chest wanted to rush. Jordan named Sophia for showing him a hip cue and pretending she hadn't. To when he got it right so the point would land on him, not on her. The room learned that memory could be trained toward respect the way a kick can be trained toward a target. Naomi stood by the exit, as always, and let the floor do the talking. Repair had become routine. Accountability had become boring in the best way. She didn't need anyone to say her name. She needed this consistency to outlast people's attention spans. In the parking lot, Denise laughed about how long it took Jordan to tie his belt. Naomi pretended not to notice that Amira had started tying hers faster without looking down. Houston kept its pace. Work kept its habits. The elevator still skipped a greeting some evenings. But one room in the city had learned to be as good as the sign on its wall. That was enough for tonight. Naomi turned off a lamp, set an alarm, checked the gas, and placed a folded towel into the dojo bag without comment. The next day would arrive on schedule. The mat would be ready. The bowl would hold. The first signs of pushback arrived in careful emails that sounded reasonable on their surface. A parent wondered if the Academy had become too focused on restraint at the expense of competitive edge. Another worried the new partner rotation chart interfered with chemistry. A third said the feedback channel felt like surveillance. None of the notes named what had really changed: consistency. Systems that used to tilt quietly now held their plane, and some people mistook the loss of favoritism for a loss of quality. The owner scheduled an open meeting in the lobby on a Saturday evening after class. No microphones, no stage, just folding chairs in a circle. The smell of cleaner faint in the air, and a stack of handouts printed in grayscale. Rick and Marisol arrived with numbers, not speeches. They had tracked 8 weeks of data, injuries down 30%, warnings issued at even rates across groups, promotion pass rates steady. Overall, with notable gains among kids who had previously plateaued under public scolding, retention up for families who had almost left. The charts were plain and small. They did not flatter anyone. They made it difficult to argue with the direction of travel. Parents spoke. One admitted he had liked the old predictability because he could sit back and know his child would be praised. Another said the new language around control moments had changed how her daughter talked about practice at home. Instead of counting bruises, she counted choices. A grandfather in a ball cap leaned forward on his cane and said the lines on the wall finally meant something when he watched from the bench. The few who had arrived prepared to object left with a packet they could not refute and an invitation to help with water, chairs, and outside events instead of commentary. The floor absorbed the meeting and carried on. Class plans began listing proof points for coaches to mark. A correction delivered quietly. A reset requested calmly. A praise that followed improvement rather than raw talent. The team board added a rotating floor steward role, an assistant tasked with catching drift early and nudging language back toward neutral. Rick didn't bristle at the oversight. He built it into the schedule the way you build a warm-up. Skip it, and the whole session runs worse. Marisol's role widened. She took over the youth program on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, set up a standing 15-minute staff debrief after every pressure night, and wrote a one-page cornering guide for parents, where to stand, how to cue breath with, a hand on a shoulder, what not to shout even when adrenaline tempts it. The guide removed guesswork without shaming anyone. It became a laminated card by the water cooler. Amira found herself drafted into leadership without a medal for it. Newer kids gravitated to her lane because she made space without announcing she was making it. She learned to set a tempo that steadied a partner rather than exposing them. The first time a nervous 9-year-old apologized for taking too much room, Amira stepped a half shoe length back and said nothing. The correction arrived as geometry, not words. The girl's shoulders lowered, and the drill smoothed out. Naomi noticed the new cadence. She stayed on the bench, brought cut fruit and spare wraps, and watched for where the work still needed reinforcement. She also took on the quiet job no one else sees, texting a reminder to Denise on the day Jordan always seemed most tired, dropping off a pack of bandages at the front desk when the roll in the kit ran out, buying a second-hand garment rack off a neighborhood app so uniforms could dry properly after community nights. She did not label these tasks as anything other than care. Outside the academy, invitations found her again. A small nonprofit gym in the 3rd Ward asked for a session on teaching corrections without humiliation. A youth pastor on the north side wanted guidance on setting rules for a new boxing program in a church rec room. Naomi brought the same index cards she had used at the academy and the same refusal to turn the work into a brand. She opened with a bow and broke it down into promises: person before performance, partner before audience, policy before preference, proof before praise. She left behind a single page of prompts and a checklist that anyone could copy. She kept her name off the foot. The past arrived in a thinner envelope than the reporter's email. It was a flyer from a community center in Beaumont, creased at the corners, announcing an anniversary night for the old basement program where Naomi had trained as a teenager when the city had fewer cranes and more payphones. The typeface was wrong, the spacing uneven, the clip art a decade out of date. It felt like home. She drove east with Amira on a Sunday afternoon under a sky the color of boiled milk. The freeway columns held up lanes like stacked shelves. They passed refineries and wide fields and billboards that promised debt relief. In a quiet near the Trinity River, Naomi pulled off onto a smaller road and let the car find an old neighborhood by muscle memory. They stopped at a narrow church with paint that had fought the sun for years. The side door stuck like it always had. The hinges protested the way metal does when it has done its job too long without thanks. Inside, the rec room still wore the scuffs of 100 drag chairs. The floor held faint outlines where tape had once marked off squares. The fans along the wall had been replaced with newer, quieter ones, but the hum carried the same note. Volunteer hours turned into air. A few people from the old days had gray in their hair, and the careful steps of survivors. Ms. Lila, who had run the sign-in clipboard and the snack table and the number one, cussing in church rule with equal authority, hugged Naomi until bones met. They told stories that stayed short on purpose. The time the AC died and everyone trained with wet towels around their necks. The cup tournament where a kid no one noticed in school suddenly filled a room with will. The day a borrowed mat split at the seam and a handful of people sewed it back, together with dental floss, while the rest worked footwork down the hallway. Nobody mentioned newspaper clippings because there hadn't been any. They named what had actually mattered, whose car had carried how many kids, who had kept a key to the back door, where the extra mouthguards were hidden when someone forgot theirs. On the drive back, the highway sped up the way it always does past dusk. Naomi told Amira the parts of the story that belonged to her, the long weekends, the cheap trophies, that tarnished by Monday, the respect that had come from people who were not impressed by volume. She spoke, finally, of Daniel. She described the way her brother had worked doubles and still found time to sit in the back at practice. The way he had looked at the mat like it was a promise someone had kept for him, too. She did not tell the details of his last night. Grief doesn't owe anyone a blow-by-blow. She did say the loss had cut her life into a before and after, and that leaving the circuit had not been about shame, but about breathing. Amira didn't ask for the videos that had surfaced after the dojo demonstration, or the clips other parents had tried to pass to her. She watched the road instead and understood that some histories are cords you hold, not banners you wave. Naomi's hand stayed steady on the wheel. The city's lights gathered them back into the same lanes they had left, and the present reclaimed them without fanfare. Spring arrived as a rumor, and then as a fact. The Academy's calendar filled with test dates, a public community night each month, and a quiet note on the corkboard about a mentorship track for assistant instructors. Marisol built the track from the ground up, observation hours logged, a short reading list that included 2 pages on bias, and 1 on de-escalation, a requirement to write a plan for a pressure session that named how to keep language clean. Rick taught the parts of curriculum that had always been his strength, and learned to let others carry the parts they were better at. Systems held. On the rare nights they wobbled, someone noticed early. A coach drifted into performance mode and caught himself halfway through a sentence. A parent started to cheer too loudly and clapped a hand over their own mouth, grinning. A child who had once accepted humiliation as part of training paused, looked to a coach, and saw the cue to reset instead of to endure. The sign on the wall stopped feeling like decoration and settled into its rightful job reminder. Amira kept moving forward on the strength of repetition that no one could see except the people who watched her every day. She tutored a 7th grader through a combination that used to tie her feet in knots and then used that same patience the next night on a geometry problem at the kitchen table. Jordan found a voice he used sparingly and well when a newcomer joked at the wrong time. Jordan's glance to Marisol was enough to steer the moment. Sophia started helping with Saturday morning basics and learned that teaching makes your own mechanics honest. Evan shifted from needing indulgence to offering it. He became the teammate who took the heavier side in drills so others could work technique first. Brian learned to convert his heat into stamina and discovered that finishing a round in control earned him more regard than finishing it breathless. He stopped selling no prisoners shirts on his social feed. He didn't make an announcement about it. The link simply disappeared. Outside invitations increased in a way that threatened to overwhelm the binder clips on Naomi's paper planner. A rec center in Gulfton asked for a Train the Trainer afternoon. A youth boxing coach from 5th Ward wanted help writing a code of conduct he could hand to parents. A YMCA program director requested the 4 promises outline she used to open sessions. Naomi typed it up without adjectives and sent it as a PDF anyone could copy and edit. She called it a toolkit only because forms need titles. In the header, where someone else might have put a logo, she wrote the 4 lines large and left it at that. Person before performance, partner before audience, policy before preference, proof before praise. The invitational schedule returned with spring. Dalton's kids traveled to a gym where last year's judging had rewarded volume. This time, they arrived with strategies. Resets were crisp, gestures to signal cautions were calm. Coaches stayed inside the lines of the posted rules and recorded lapses with timestamps rather than arguments. The head table took them seriously because they had arrived prepared. Amira moved through her bracket without needing a story to be told after. She lost a final by a clean point, and the handshake was honest on both sides. No one had to advocate for her dignity because the structure had done it first. Near the end of the season, the Academy combined 2 ceremonies, promotions and acknowledgements. Belts were tied quickly, names were read without favor, then older students named instances of respect they had witnessed. The list was short, precise, and perfect. A boy thanked a partner for asking to reset when contact rose. A girl thanked an assistant for correcting her alone, instead of from the rail. Amira thanked a newcomer for stepping forward when fear wanted him to step back. Jordan thanked Sophia for teaching him a hip cue and predicting that he'd forget it once so she could remind him without an audience. The room's memory continued to be trained toward what it wanted to become. Afterward, people lingered. The owner announced that Marisol would take on the title of head youth coach. Rick shook her hand, said well earned, and meant it. The code of conduct was reprinted with her edits, which emphasized how to intervene early and quietly. The anonymous line on the corkboard was retitled Suggestions and Observations because the room no longer needed a place to whisper complaints. It needed a place to practice shared responsibility. Naomi stood near the door under a rectangle of sunlight and watched the Academy clean itself up. Pads stacked, tape peels rubbed off with a thumb, uniforms hung to air. She didn't think about the night in the circle, or the old clips, or the envelope from Beaumont. She thought about the shoebox at home and how the latest papers in it were boring. A schedule, a checklist, a one-page policy. Boring documents change rooms more reliably than dramatic moments. On a soft evening stitched with small winds, she and Amira walked to the car without hurry. The bag landed on the back seat in the same spot as always. Habit, too, is a kind of dignity. They didn't narrate what the months had meant. The evidence was visible. Shoulders that stayed down, breaths that didn't catch wind. A coach approached, a sign on a wall that finally matched the hands that taught. In the side mirror, the academy door swung shut and the bell gave its tired jingle. It sounded like a room returning to maintenance after a long stretch of repair. They drove with the windows cracked, the city's noise braided with the hum of tires. At a light, Amira glanced down at the stripe on her belt and then out at the slow parade of storefronts. She didn't speak. The day didn't require commentary. Naomi turned onto their street and parked beneath the tree that refused to die. They carried the bag upstairs, the strap leaving a crease on Naomi's shoulder that would fade by morning. The apartment smelled faintly of soap and something green. The quiet settled into each room in the satisfying way it does when the work has been done for the day. There would be other gyms that needed the 4 promises, other coaches who would bristle and then listen, other kids who had learned all the wrong lessons and would need the right ones repeated until they sank into muscle. There would be emails that mistook attention for praise and meetings where names went unlearned. There would be Saturdays when a belt felt too heavy, and Tuesdays when the bus was late. The practice would hold. Naomi set the bag by the door, checked the freezer for a spare ice pack, and laid a clean towel over the back of a chair to dry. She turned off a lamp, looked once at the window where the city blinked, and let the day close without insisting on the last word. The last word belonged to a bow, to a hand steadying a partner, to a coach correcting language before it cut, to a mother measuring success by breaths, not headlines. In a city that teaches many lessons badly, a room had learned to teach the essential ones well. That strength without humility is noise. That control is proof of care. That discipline begins in the bow, and that every child deserves a floor that remembers what the sign on the wall says long after someone stops pointing at it. It makes you wonder, in our own lives, how often do we walk past moments where someone needs us to notice, to step in quietly, or to hold a line when no one else will? Maybe real change doesn't always arrive with noise and applause. Sometimes it comes in whispers, in steady habits, in the courage to stay when it's easier to leave. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in second chances, in overlooked voices, and in the small acts that can build a fairer world. And before you go, tell us in the comments, who in your life has shown you that real strength isn't about power, it's about restraint, fairness, and care? Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for being part of a community that values stories like these. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and never forget, sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest truth.